In July 1944, at Northfield, Guam, a single B-29 roared down the strip faster than any before it. 4 Wright R-3350 engines thundered, lifting the island's dust like smoke. But the change was not in power, it was in motion. The bomber rose early, straight, and clean. For months, Superfortresses had burned their own wheels before leaving ground. Brake lines trapped heat, dragging against thousands of pounds of weight. Crews called it design error. Pilots blamed chance. Every takeoff consumed fuel meant for Japan. One mechanic broke the rule. He rerouted a single brake line using scavenged tubing from a wrecked wing. The idea looked reckless, even dangerous, a stupid fix that risked total hydraulic loss. But when the throttles opened, pressure fell to zero, and the aircraft lifted 20 seconds sooner. On the next sortie, interceptors never closed. The great bomber climbed steady, its brakes cold to the touch. Engines held rhythm across 12 hours of flight. The laughter ended quietly. Over Japan, the stupid line turned friction into speed. What began as defiance became proof. A small correction, invisible to command, had changed the fastest machine in the Pacific sky. By early 1944, the B-29 project hung between triumph and collapse. The Superfortress was the largest machine the United States had ever built for war, and every one of its systems carried new math. Its hydraulics powered gear, flaps, and brakes through miles of thin lines designed for laboratory air, not island heat. On Guam and Tinian, that perfection turned to hazard. At Northfield, takeoffs began like rituals of endurance. 4 engines screamed, brake pads smoked, and wheels glowed before liftoff. Fully loaded at 65,000 kilograms, the bomber rolled for nearly 2 miles before its tires left coral. Each second of drag burned fuel meant for the climb. Each mission began in heat and ended in arithmetic loss. Command blamed inexperience. Boeing blamed climate. None admitted the obvious. That design born in Kansas could not breathe in the Pacific. Hydraulic fluid expanded in closed loops until pressure trapped itself inside the wheel wells. The return valve bled too slowly, and the temperature climbed to 480 degrees Fahrenheit. Brakes never fully opened. Crews called the pattern the slow fire. Accidents came in clusters. One week saw 4 bombers burn before rotation. Others overran the strip or exploded from overheated hubs. Manuals offered tables and tolerances. Mechanics answered with buckets of seawater and silence. Each night ended the same way, with one less aircraft on the ramp. Among those watching was a quiet flight engineer who had fixed farm tractors before the war. He knew the sound of pressure that refused to die. During taxi runs, he noticed the needles never fell to zero even after full release. Heat made the fluid swell. The system fought itself. It was not defect, it was expansion without escape. He proposed rerouting a return line through a cooler space behind the wing spar, allowing air to carry away residual heat. His chief laughed. The manuals were perfect, he said. The design had passed every test, but tests did not include coral dust or tropical humidity. So the engineer waited. He bled lines longer than orders required, measured the hiss of release, and logged temperatures in pencil. Every line of data pointed to the same truth. The brakes were working against the plane. By mid-year, the problem had become routine despair. Mechanics started each shift knowing how it would end. Smoke, water, replacement, and another note marked pilot error. The airfield's night horizon flickered with fires that no enemy caused. The B-29 was supposed to end the war through altitude and speed, yet it could barely free itself from its own weight. The distances from the Marianas to Japan measured 1,200 miles, but the greater distance lay between design and reality. He stood in that gap, one hand on a hot brake drum cooling in the dark. The steel clicked as it shrank. He traced the curve of the line that fed it and understood the problem was simple. Too much pressure, too little room to breathe. No one yet imagined that a single meter of steel tubing, bent by hand, unseen beneath armor and dust, would soon let an empire's bombers fly the way they were drawn on paper. The solution waited, silent. inside the sound of air escaping from a valve. It began without orders in the shadow of a hangar roof stained black from exhaust. The flight engineer spread a folded hydraulic diagram across an oil drum and traced the pressure path with his thumb. The twin brake circuits ran from the cockpit's master cylinder to the wheel wells, then back through a single return valve. On paper, it worked perfectly. In practice, heat trapped the fluid until it pushed back against the system. After release, the gauge still read 800 pounds per square inch, enough to keep friction alive. He wrote figures in pencil on the margin. At 480 degrees Fahrenheit, the fluid's expansion exceeded 10%. The trapped volume meant constant drag. Each minute of taxi cost fuel, speed, and endurance. The manuals offered nothing beyond inspection intervals. The problem was not maintenance, it was geometry. The path had no escape. He scavenged a narrow aluminum tube from a wrecked wing assembly, 3 millimeters wide inside. It had once carried fuel to a tank vent. He cleaned it with solvent, flared both ends by hand, and fitted them into the return loop behind the spar. The bypass would open only when temperature forced pressure high enough to expel excess fluid, then close as the system cooled. It was a relief valve without a spring, a design born of instinct, not permission. When he showed it to his crew chief, the reaction was a half laugh, half warning. Unauthorized modification meant grounding. "That line'll burst before you taxi 10 yards, the chief said. The engineer nodded, but kept the wrench turning. In 2 hours, the new loop was sealed, disguised beneath a panel marked Return Inspection. No one wrote it down. Next morning, test ship 42-63613 stood ready for an engine run. The pilot advanced throttles. Gauges trembled under vibration. The engineer's eyes stayed on the brake indicator. The needle rose, paused, and fell to 0. Clean. For the first time in months, the brakes cooled faster than the air around them. After 10 stops and releases, the hub measured 300 degrees Fahrenheit, down nearly 200 from the previous day. The line held. By afternoon, rumors drifted through the maintenance bays. Crews from neighboring stands came to see the strange curve of tubing hidden beneath the wing roots. Some laughed again, others copied it in chalk on the floor. Within 48 hours, 12 aircraft carried the same alteration. Each took off without smoke. He recorded results in a notebook already stained by oil, taxi distance, pressure decay, liftoff speed, temperature drop. The pattern repeated with precision. Takeoff roll shortened by 300 feet. Acceleration gain from 165 to 178 miles per hour. Fuel flow dropped 200 gallons across the climb. In war, no larger miracle existed. When inspectors asked why engine data looked improved, chiefs blamed favorable wind. The reports passed upward, coded as routine variance. No one wanted to explain that the island's airfield had solved what the factory could not. By September, he refined the design. Both brake returns now ran through twin bypass lines shielded by cut aluminum plates scavenged from a bomb rack. Airflow cooled the tubes in flight, creating a steady thermal cycle. Pressure reached 2,400 psi under braking, dropped instantly to 0 after release. The numbers were consistent. The risk remained invisible. He drew a small chart with measured intervals. Taxi, start, rise, peak, release, vent. The shape of the curve reminded him of a breathing chest. The aircraft, through one extra line, exhaled between takeoffs. He smiled at the symmetry. Machines, he thought, survive the same way people do, by letting pressure go somewhere. Technical divisions back home still debated failures. Memos described improper pilot handling and incorrect fluid blends. On the islands, men tightened fittings and watched pressure needles drop to 0. The proof was mechanical, not procedural. The bypass spread without a single order. Mechanics from other groups copied the layout, using whatever scrap tubing they found, fuel lines, oxygen lines, even conduit from wrecked light towers. The dimensions changed, but the logic held. Every bomber that carried the fix climbed cleaner, held formation longer, and landed with cool wheels. The improvement was so uniform that statisticians began marking the pattern in performance charts without knowing why. The engineer avoided attention. He understood that regulation moved slower than need. Each time an aircraft returned without fire scars on its brakes, he wiped its hub with a rag and checked for leaks. None appeared. The field notebooks began to look like design documents. By October, he estimated more than 30 aircraft across the command used the modification. It was now a shared secret, an open code of survival. Ground chiefs called it breathing the brakes. The phrase passed from tool bench to flight deck, spreading through a war that rewarded anything that worked. Maintenance records started showing new trends. Brake replacements fell by half. Hydraulic fluid consumption dropped sharply. Engine start delays disappeared. The aircraft that once crawled from dispersal now moved like parts of a machine synchronized beyond its maker's intent. He did not see invention in it, only correction. Air does the work, he told a younger mechanic as they tested another ship. You just give it a path. The simplicity of the statement hid its depth. Every complex system fails where it cannot release what it builds. When evening came, he sat under a wing, writing results in the margin of his old diagram. The paper smelled of graphite and dust. Above him, the aircraft that had once fought itself now stood balanced on cooling wheels. He tapped the metal once, not to test it, but to listen. The sound was even. The pressure was gone. The war had given him no rank, no citation, but one measure of truth. Perfection was not built in factories. It was built where heat meets hands. The design of victory had come from a single line of steel, curved by instinct and held together by faith in numbers that no one had ordered him to believe. Before sunrise, the first line of bombers idled in fog that glowed orange from exhaust. Ground crews stood knee-deep in coral dust, wiping oil from goggles, counting seconds until clearance. Engines thundered at 45 inches of manifold pressure, each aircraft trembling against its brakes. The new bypass line, small as a finger, lay hidden beneath panels now cool to the touch. The signal came. Throttles advanced to full takeoff power, 4 Wright engines screaming in unison. The first B-29 rolled, gathered speed, and lifted several hundred feet earlier than predicted. Tower observers marked it, rotation at 3,800 feet instead of 42. No smoke, no burning rubber. The airfield stayed silent except for the sound of acceleration. Within minutes, another bomber followed, then another. Each performed the same impossible act, full load, full heat, yet no drag. Takeoff spacing narrowed, and the sky filled with aluminum shapes climbing into the mist. The pattern repeated until the entire squadron vanished toward Japan, leaving behind a runway unscarred by flame. On the ground, mechanics checked gauges left running in the open hangar. Pressure dropped to 0 within seconds of each test. Brake hub readings fell by nearly 40% compared to the previous month. The fix had become a law of motion, not a rumor. The airfield's rhythm changed. Schedules shortened. Tension disappeared. By the second week, commanders noticed a strange efficiency in departure logs. Every launch hit its slot to the minute. Fuel reserves after climb showed higher margins. The crews had not changed. The aircraft had. The bypass line gave them consistency, and consistency gave them speed. In flight, the difference became measurable. Turbos stabilized earlier, cylinder head temperature fell within safe limits, and climb rate reached 1,300 feet per minute. Pilots felt it as balance, no lag, no drag, no hesitation between throttle and lift. The B-29, once called unpredictable, now behaved like a machine perfected through repetition. Check brakes, the engineer called during the climb test. The indicator stayed flat. 0, he said. The word carried more relief than celebration. For the first time, power translated directly into altitude. The bomber rose above scattered cloud layers, engines holding 2,600 revolutions per minute, oil temperature steady at 210 degrees Fahrenheit. Numbers that once flickered wildly now held like carved stone. By midday, formations over the Pacific formed with new precision. Before, weaker ships dragged, forcing leads to throttle back and lose distance. Now climb profiles aligned within seconds. The bypass line had removed the hidden resistance that fractured discipline. The squadron moved like an assembly line in air, each bomber maintaining a fixed position without correction calls. The effect compounded with every mission. Shorter takeoffs meant more fuel on target. Cooler brakes meant less stress on gear. Even engine wear decreased. Data confirmed lower manifold pressure required to achieve the same rate of climb. The fix had crossed from technical repair into operational doctrine without anyone naming it. Across the Pacific, radar operators noted the change first. Intercept timings no longer matched predicted altitudes. Japanese controllers launched fighters late, finding only empty sky. The bombers had added minutes to their lead by saving seconds at takeoff. Over the home islands, those seconds became survival. Each squadron reported similar gains. Abort rates from hydraulic faults dropped to near zero. Maintenance logs shrank to single lines, reading no defects. The war's largest aircraft had stopped fighting itself. The difference was invisible, but it was total. Night brought new launches under dim blue lamps. The coral strip glowed under moonlight, and every takeoff left nothing behind but dust. Mechanics watched the heavy machines move as if weightless. Engines roared, flaps rose, wheels folded, all without friction, without fear. What had begun as a scrap of tubing now powered an entire strategy. By mid-October, the bypass was everywhere. Crews from neighboring units copied the layout and passed it on without paperwork. Breathing brakes, they called it, half joke, half code. The fix moved faster than command itself, a network of unspoken trust linking hundreds of men who had learned the same lesson. War rewards what works. Performance graphs confirmed the rumor. Takeoff roll shortened by 300 to 400 feet. Hydraulic temperature stabilized under 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Sortie intervals tightened by 10 minutes. Even the island's fuel depots recorded slower depletion rates. The improvement spread across the entire command, invisible to policy, unstoppable in fact. By the third month, ground officers realized the truth. They no longer waited for smoke. They waited for silence. Silence meant the system held. The coral airstrips that once burned black now stayed pale under sunlight. Crews no longer ran for extinguishers. They logged data. The war's loudest engine had learned to start quietly. Each test flight produced new confidence. Airspeed stabilized at 178 miles per hour during climb. Fuel burn remained constant across load variations. The hydraulics no longer dictated performance. They obeyed it. At the end of every flight, the engineer stepped down the ladder and pressed his hand against the hub. Warm, never hot. The metal felt alive but controlled, like muscle at rest. He smiled without speaking. Numbers had replaced miracles. From Saipan to Tinian, the story repeated. Launches smoother, missions longer, recoveries cleaner. Commanders began to trust the clock again. The war's tempo shifted from survival to precision. For the first time, the pace of air power matched the scale of industry behind it. When the last bomber cleared the horizon that morning, the island stayed still. The sound of engines faded into the wind, leaving only the rustle of waves against coral. The fix, invisible and unapproved, had turned fear into mathematics. Every takeoff after that carried a truth the manuals had missed. Speed does not come from strength alone, but from the release of what holds it back. By late 1944, the change traveled faster than paperwork. Crews spoke in numbers, not theories. Sortie reliability curved upward on every board. The fix needed no champion. A short tube under the spar had turned friction into margin and margin into time. Time, spread across hundreds of aircraft, became distance the enemy could not close. Reports called it discipline. The ramps called it breathing. Night cycles proved the scale. Under blue lamps, clamps clicked, gauges bled, and the line stayed cool. Departure gaps narrowed to minutes without strain. The coral strip kept its pale color where fire had scorched it months before. Mechanics stopped staging buckets near the threshold. Extinguishers gathered dust under benches. The quiet looked like luck. It was not luck. It was repeatability. Data hardened the rumor. Average roll fell from 4,200 feet to near 3,800 on Coral. Climb to 1,000 feet dropped from 8 minutes 20 seconds to 7.5. Cylinder head temperature held near 420 degrees Fahrenheit at initial climb. Manifold pressure steadied at 45 inches of mercury without detonation. Fuel flow settled near 260 gallons per hour per engine through 8,000. The pattern refused to break. Across the chain, planners adjusted to the new floor. Launch ladders were redrawn with tighter rungs. The first turn toward Japan arrived earlier, and formations set their step without shouting. Weak ships no longer dragged the line. Leaders kept power where doctrine required, not where mercy demanded. Within a week, schedules advanced as if a tailwind had blown through the planning room. The wind was mechanical. Enemy radar noticed first. Plots that used to intersect now missed by minutes. Controllers at Kyushu marked altitude predictions, then watched the stream slide past beyond reach. The interceptors climbed on cue, fast and clean, but found fewer targets within their band. Seconds saved on Coral translated into miles won over water. Over cities, those miles became immunity. Pursuit began later. It ended earlier. Crews felt it in the cockpit as a subtler load. Turbos found their set point without long coaxing. Oil stayed within tolerance. The long climb shifted from contest to procedure. Formation calls fell to a rhythm of headings and times. With drag gone, the bomber behaved like the diagram promised in Kansas. Confidence rose, not as bravado, but as pacing. When machines become predictable, men conserve breath. Operations tested the ceiling. A mass strike pulled nearly 500 aircraft from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian under heavy wind. Loads were high, reserves slim, and margins thin by design. The line held. Rotation arrived short of forecast on every runway. No aborts for heat, no bursts of tire smoke turning to flame. Tower clocks kept cadence with engines, and the ocean took the sound like a long, even note. The hazard had lost its place. Records grew precise. Brake service intervals stretched from 4 sorties to 9. Hydraulic fluid demand fell by near 1/2 across the month. Heat check failures on the ramp dropped into single digits against hundreds inspected. Engines met the same targets with less throttle in climb, a small savings that multiplied across hours. The math turned stubborn. Every column pointed the same way. Inspection teams visited without ceremony. Officers crawled under wings, traced the arc of added tubing, and asked for forms that did not exist. Chiefs offered results instead. Photographs traveled back with cargo, arriving at Wright Field beside spare pumps and cracked manifolds. Stateside engineers graphed the field numbers against lab curves and found the difference irreducible. The factory had argued with heat. The island had negotiated with it. The modification acquired a name no manual used. Crews called it the breathing line. It spread by sight, not memo, copied from airframe to airframe with small deviations that left performance unchanged. Aluminum shields from old bomb racks became heat sinks. Oxygen conduit turned into return links. Nothing exotic entered the system, only logic did. When a part failed from vibration, another replaced it within an hour. The idea never cracked. Enemy reaction shifted from tactics to paperwork. Intercept planners widened patrol boxes and advanced scramble times. Fuel shortages erased both changes by noon. Pilots who once hunted at comfort altitudes now chased climbs that ended one layer above their ceiling. Gun cameras showed trails receding instead of widening. Reports used the same verb again and again. The bombers maintained. Maintenance had won a tactical sentence. In December, a crew returned from Nagoya with a flat statement in the gunner's log. Speed held, climb maintained, intercept lost. No exclamation followed. The line read like a checklist item. That cold phrasing carried the weight of a doctrine born on a bench. War turns to policy when it stops surprising its own side. The breathing line had become policy without ink. The ripple reached supply. Crates of seals lasted weeks. Tires stacked higher than forecasts. Fuel ships met lower draw than manifests predicted. A quiet surplus spread across the key, then fed other shortages. The fix paid for radios and armor that had waited behind seals and pads. Logistics behaves like water. Remove one stone, and flow finds the next. Island officers learned that economics can start in a tube the width of a pencil. Training altered in step. New crews learned to check for cold hubs by touch during walk-around. Bleed sequences were reordered to confirm zero pressure before taxi. A short line entered every brief. Confirm return to zero after release. No one said why to newcomers. They discovered the reason at the threshold when the roll stayed clean and the lift felt early. The lesson did not need voice. The gauge taught it. The fix met its own limits as the tempo climbed. Vibration hardened metal. A tube cracked after hundreds of hours, misting fluid and dropping pressure on landing. The crew extended gear by hand, stopped with minimal drag, and taxied to a stand without flame. The engineer replaced the segment by template and logged another hour against a pattern that still worked. Perfection in war is not immortal. It is replaceable. That is enough. By early 1945, analysts named the new cadence launch certainty. It measured the shortest interval at which a field could move steel safely. The line raised that measure until human factors, not hydraulics, became the limit. Controllers spoke in minutes again. Crews slept by schedule instead of alarm. The campaign turned into a long machine whose first gear finally ceased grinding against itself. From that point, decisions about targets carried fewer hidden costs. Stateside, design work absorbed the lesson. Test memos noted pressure-compensated returns for the B-50 and the first jets. Tolerance bands narrowed. Heat maps moved away from wheel wells. The field had dragged blueprints into new shapes. The drawings did not mention coral dust, salt crust, or the taste of burnt rubber. They showed arcs and arrows that meant the same thing: give pressure a path. The enemy's last counters never reached doctrine. Alcohol blends replaced fuel in engines that coughed past 1,000 meters. Airframes shook against limits. Squadrons launched without brakes, rolling into grass to stop. While one side learned to breathe, the other learned to starve. Interceptions died in scheduling before they died in air. Above 30,000 feet, the only remaining opponent was time. The line had already stolen some of that, too. In March, the firebombing pace demanded absolute synchronization. Engines lit at 0500, lines bled at 0515, first roll at 0530, second at 0533, third at 0536. At scale, those numbers decide whether a city burns or survives. Every previous delay had cracked that sequence. The bypass sealed it. The stream crossed the coast on rhythm, bays opened on mark, and egress began with fuel still inside tolerance. The raid wrote itself in cadence. Afterward, the island returned to its careful quiet. Men checked hubs with bare hands and found warmth only. Pressure sat at zero. The engineer who had bent the first tube ran his thumb along a shield's edge and felt only smooth metal. He wrote 4 words in his notebook beneath a column of figures. Held under full load. It was a sentence of victory that fit on one line. The sum did not shout. It accumulated. Launch after launch confirmed that the smallest correction had scaled into strategy. The coral strips no longer prepared for fire. They prepared for timing. Each bomber that rolled past the threshold carried a fraction of saved fuel, a handful of saved seconds, and a reserve of saved belief. Turn those into hundreds, and the Pacific grew small. The enemy felt that shrinkage before they saw the aircraft. By month's end, boards in operations showed 2 curves diverging. One traced intercept time, one traced formation speed. The gap widened beyond overlap. No slogans filled the space. The numbers were enough. Crews erased the board, turned toward the line, and started the next cycle. The fix did not ask for credit. It asked for repetition. War answered with more of both. By March 1945, the B-29 offensive had reached its mechanical limit. Every pattern, checklist, and cycle had hardened into perfection. The aircraft that once limped from the coral now launched like clockwork. The war in the Pacific no longer advanced through invention. It advanced through repetition. The system ran at full tension, flawless and fragile. At North Field, launches began before dawn. Engines thundered one after another across 2 miles of coral runway. Each departure carried 12 men, 12 tons of bombs, and the last patience of its crew. The bypass line had erased the old friction. Nothing smoked, nothing stalled. The sequence became sound. 3 minutes between roars, the pause of engines held at 45 inches manifold, then release. But perfection breeds its own failure. As sortie rates doubled, so did fatigue. Mechanics slept on toolboxes between shifts. Hydraulics worked without complaint, yet every bearing, cable, and valve aged faster under constant motion. The B-29 was no longer a machine. It was a process, and processes wear from success as much as strain. Each bomber lifted at 65,000 kilograms, climbing through cloud into thin air that froze metal at -30. Oil congealed around pistons even as cylinder heads burned above 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Turbos whined at 28,000 revolutions per minute for 12 straight hours. The line had removed one weakness but revealed the next: heat without rest. In the Pacific, production still fed the tempo. Every island became a node in a system that behaved like a conveyor stretching across ocean. When one flight landed, another rose. Time between sorties fell below 12 hours. Fuel drums turned faster than supply ships. Crews learned to move by instinct, sleeping only during refueling cycles. War had become an equation of throughput, not courage. The Japanese Air Command tried to respond through mathematics of its own. Intercept charts filled with red corrections, approach speeds, climb curves, intercept times. Every recalculation ended too late. B-29s crossed the coast 5 minutes ahead of projection, and in air combat, 5 minutes meant the difference between defense and ruin. Fighters scrambled into trails they could no longer catch. Engines that once outran heavy bombers now overheated, trying to climb high enough to see them. The engineer watched it all from the ground. His data, copied from field logs, now appeared in official reports he never signed. Takeoff distance reduced 8%, pressure decay normal, no brake failure since August. The numbers traveled upward, detached from hands that had written them in oil and sweat. He smiled at their anonymity. The fix had become doctrine. By April, sortie completion reached 97%. Brake anomalies accounted for less than 1 in 1,000 failures. The aircraft behaved exactly as designed, and that exactness carried danger. Commanders began to schedule missions closer, trusting the new certainty too completely. Men and machines blurred into the same schedule, efficient, exact, and near exhaustion. Engines began failing not from defect but from duration. Bearings seized after 500 hours. Turbos cracked from vibration. Crews patched with what they had and flew again. The bypass line still worked perfectly, but the rest of the bomber strained under the pace it had made possible. On one night raid over Osaka, a bomber returned with streaks of hydraulic fluid along its belly. The right side line had fractured under resonance, a hairline crack invisible in inspection. Pressure bled slowly through the climb. The pilot extended landing gear manually, touched down on dry coral, and stopped without smoke. The failure ended not in fire, but fatigue. The engineer replaced the line by template, checked its flare, and noted, repaired, tolerances intact. It was the smallest proof of what the system had become, perfection repeating itself until it thinned. Enemy reaction shifted from hope to silence. Fuel depots burned faster than they refilled. Aluminum became rationed to the gram. Fighters launched with half tanks and no brakes, gliding into fields to stop. On radar, the mainland flickered with fewer returns each night. Japan was running out of air. The raids over Tokyo proved the scale. Hundreds of bombers lifted from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian in intervals measured by the second. Their altimeters climbed together, a moving wall of engines. At 25000 feet, the stream steadied. Below, cities vanished in smoke that merged with cloud. From above, the destruction looked like weather. The engineer's notebook, now thick with graphite lines, recorded every variable. Cylinder head temperature 420 F. Pressure return 0. Roll 3,900 feet. Liftoff speed 178 miles per hour. Each page spoke the same language, a calmness that numbers hold when truth becomes routine. Back and home, reports reached the Bureau of Aeronautics. Field Adaptation B-29 brake system confirmed effective. Incorporate pressure-compensated return circuit for post-war designs. The phrase ended a war that had begun in fire and ended in paperwork. The island mechanic had written his name into the logic of machines without signing it. By May, the raids no longer required luck, targets burned in sequence. Weather mattered less than schedule. Launch certainty had become a metric equal to bomb load. The bypass line, unseen, unmarked, had altered the tempo of the largest air campaign in history. But perfection erases suspense, and when suspense dies, only endurance remains. Crews began to speak less, their confidence turning to quiet fatigue. They trusted the aircraft more than themselves. Even the engineer felt it, till pride edged with unease. He knew that every system ends where improvement meets saturation. Maintenance now recorded fewer tasks, but deeper cracks. Airframes vibrated beyond tolerance. Engines survived by fractions, yet command demanded constancy. The war's rhythm refused to slow. By June, B-29 losses from fatigue outnumbered those from combat. The enemy was gone, but inertia remained. He walked the ramp one evening after a storm. Lightning still flickered over the ocean. The coral surface steamed. Around him, aircraft waited for night missions already briefed. He touched one hub and felt warmth still rising from the metal. Inside that heat was the history of every flight since the fix began. The plane would launch again in hours. So would he. The war ended weeks later, but not for him. Statistics came before news. Hydraulic fire incidents 0, total sorties 6,000, system efficiency 99.3%. The number meant closure, yet also completion, the final moment when improvement can no longer justify itself. He closed his notebook and marked the last entry with one line. System complete. The surrender arrived with no sound. Crews gathered in hangars, waiting for orders that did not come. Engines cooled. Pressure needles rested at 0, as they always had since the fix. The air smelled of metal and rain. He tightened one last fitting, wiped his hands, and stood still as silence spread across the field. Around him, hundreds of aircraft rested in symmetry, their brakes cold, their valves empty, their systems perfect. The war's loudest weapon had achieved its quietest state. The B-29 story ended without a final flight. Its triumph was not speed or altitude, but balance, a machine that finally stopped fighting itself. The same line of tubing that had made it unstoppable had also shown where all progress ends, at 0 pressure, where the machine breathes out for the last time. The engineer looked once more at the horizon, where clouds glowed faintly over Japan. The noise had faded, but its logic remained. Victory, he thought, was not power. It was release. Then he left the ramp, leaving the wrench where it fell, beside the line that had outlived the war. In September 1945, silence replaced the engine thunder that had filled the Pacific for 2 years. The coral runways no longer burned, no longer shook under the weight of aluminum. Rows of B-29s sat wingtip to wingtip under the sun, their metal dull with salt, their wheels resting cold. The air smelled of dust and old fuel. The war had ended not in noise, but in equilibrium. At North Field, the same engineer walked the line of quiet machines. Each brake hub he touched felt cool, smooth, balanced. He had measured victory not by sorties or bombs, but by temperature. The absence of heat was proof that the system, his system, had reached its final state. When news of surrender arrived, he was tightening a fitting under a wing. The radio crackled, but he did not stop. Pressure still needed to read 0. In hangars across Guam, crews dismantled what had once moved continents. The great hydraulic pumps were drained, valves capped, and the small bypass lines, the ones that had rewritten the war, tagged for analysis. Some went to Wright Field for study, others stayed bolted to forgotten aircraft awaiting storage. No one marked their origin. The fix that had kept the fleet alive now became surplus metal in an army of ghosts. Official reports called it a field adaptation of hydraulic return. Test units in Ohio repeated the experiment, confirming the island data within 10%. Engineers noted improved cooling efficiency, faster pressure drop, and a measurable gain in climb performance. The description was sterile. The effect was not. Every post-war bomber, from the B-50 to the early jet prototypes, carried that same curved line hidden beneath armor, a quiet inheritance from coral and heat. The engineer never saw those results. He had already gone home to Missouri, where tractors and irrigation lines waited. His hands, once black with fuel, now turned soil instead of bolts. He spoke little about the war. When asked, he said only that machines work best when allowed to breathe. It was all the explanation he ever gave. Decades later, technical manuals still included the same circuit, pressure-compensated return, tolerance plus or minus 10%. No annotation, no credit. Only a line on a schematic that others took for granted. But every pilot who rolled down a runway in peace owed a few seconds of clean motion to that nameless curve of steel. The veterans remembered differently. They recalled the nights when coral glowed from friction, when every takeoff felt like gambling with fire, and how that fear vanished one morning when the brakes stayed cold. The change was invisible, but so complete that few ever thought of it again. That is the mark of a true solution, to disappear into normalcy. Statistics kept the memory more faithfully than men did. From August 1944 to August 1945, over 6,000 sorties launched from the Marianas. None were lost to break fires. Maintenance hours per plane fell by 40%. Fuel reserves per mission increased by measurable margin. Every number confirmed what instinct had already proven. One line of steel had made order from chaos. On his final morning at the base, the engineer stood beside a grounded bomber awaiting storage. Its polished nose bore a fading name and a chipped mission tally. He pressed his palm to the wheel hub. The surface was cold even in sunlight. Beneath it, the line still sat where he had left it, silent, intact, eternal. He looked out toward the ocean that had once carried the sound of engines and saw nothing but calm water. The war that had consumed pressure, fuel, and men had exhaled for the last time. The machines would rust, the airfields crumble, but the principle would remain: control pressure, and the system endures. The coral field shimmered in the heat, wind moving across it like breath. The sky above was empty, balanced, and clean. What began as defiance had become a rule of engineering, and the only sound left was the whisper of air passing through metal that no longer burned. The Pacific sky cleared again, its silence unbroken by engines. The bombers that had once crossed it by the hundreds now slept beneath tarps, wings folded in rows like resting hands. Their brakes were cold, their gauges still, their pressure equalized. No banners flew over the coral runways. The war had ended exactly as the machines were built to end, by reaching zero. From blueprints to coral dust, the B-29 had embodied scale beyond comprehension. Yet its final triumph was microscopic, a short line of steel that gave heat a path to escape. One act of reason inside the chaos had restored motion to an empire of weight. That mechanic's stupid idea had outlived his name. It became regulation, then assumption, then background noise of flight. Every aircraft that rolled safely afterward carried that logic inside its bones. History remembers fire and altitude, not the absence of both. But endurance is victory, measured in silence. Over Japan, where flame once marked the sky, only wind remained, clear, level, unresisting. Pressure had found its end, and with it, the war itself. The last lesson of the B-29 was simple. Every system survives by learning how to let go.